So today we're going to be chatting about my least favorite books of 2020. And while this reading year was pretty good overall, there definitely were some books that just didn't really meet the mark and books that I didn't really end up enjoying. So I have 10 books, but one of them is more of a honorable mention rather than a truly disappointing book, but one that I wanted to talk about because is a pretty hyped book that a lot of other people really enjoyed and I didn't end up loving. But anyways, let's go ahead and get started. So my honorable mention, which I'm not going to truly put in this video because there are parts of this book that I really enjoyed, but my honorable mention is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by Victoria Schwab. I just found this book to be so slow, and while I did really appreciate the character development and I did really feel like I got to know Addie, there were pages and pages and pages where it felt like nothing would go by. And I do understand that could have been an artistic choice just because for her, there were years and years and years of her life that went by where she didn't meet anyone and nothing changed for her. I get that, but as a reader, it just became very monotonous and boring. I think I gave it a 3.5 stars. It just didn't really come together for me, and I really enjoyed the Darker Shade of Magic series more than Addie LaRue. All right, so coming in at number 9 is In a Dark, Dark Wood by Ruth Ware. So this year, I kind of sought out to read more Ruth Ware books because, as you know, Turn of the Key is one of my favorite books that I read this year, and I really wanted to kind of look at some of the other things that she has written. So I listened to In a Dark, Dark Wood mainly on audio. This is a book that follows this bachelorette party, and it takes place in a dark, dark wood. Things kind of go wrong. That's all I'm going to say about the plot because plot is kind of far-fetched and ridiculous, but whatever. The thing that I found about this book that didn't make any sense is these characters knew each other in high school, and then 10 years later, they come to this bachelorette party and they have all of this petty crap from high school that they haven't addressed. Not only have they not addressed it, they're acting as if these things happened yesterday. And I'm why was it none of this talked about until someone invited you to go to a cabin in the woods where no one is nearby? It just didn't make sense to me as a setup. Ultimately, I think I gave it a 3 stars. It was fine. It wasn't great. I'll probably will still end up picking up more Ruth Ware because of how much I love Turn of the Key, but this one just kind of missed the mark for me. All right, next up is Everyone Brave is Forgiven by Cleave. This was a World War II historical fiction. And honestly, one of the reasons why I'm realizing that I didn't like it at all is because it was so forgettable. I cannot remember any of the characters' names. I cannot remember anything that happened. And I just felt like the writing was very distanced in a time where there was so much emotion and there was so much happening. And, these characters were going through a lot. Some of them were fighting in the war. Others were in the resistance at home and they were going through hell. And I didn't feel any of it. None of it came off the page. And I don't really understand why or how, but it just felt very bland for me. I kind of wanted to just dust off the cover of it and just let the life come out. It is in a class with The Nightingale and All the Light We Cannot See, which are some of my favorite books of all time. So I know that I am comparing it to books that I absolutely loved, but just felt not quite there for me. Next up, we have Little Secrets by Jennifer Hillier. I read this around the time that I was moving here to this new city, and I wanted to read something that would just be fun, gripping, interesting thriller that would be something that I could take my mind off the move with. The problem with this book is that it didn't really live up to what it was advertised as. And so maybe that's more of a problem of the advertisers or the marketers of the book rather than the book itself. But this is kind of described as a child disappearing in this busy marketplace, and basically after that the family has fallen apart, as you could expect. The husband is having an affair, and basically the wife figures out that the person the husband is with might have something to do with the disappearance. That to me seemed like a really interesting jumping off point. Kind of a plot convenience, but also a really interesting jumping off point. It ended up being this weird psychological, how far will you go for the ones you love book, which is fine, but that's just not what I was expecting. But I just thought there was gonna be more emphasis on finding this poor child and less on these people just being messed up, terrible people. So all right, next up is Girl Stop Apologizing, and I am spacing on the author's name. I'm so sorry. I will put it on the screen. This is a self-help book that is meant to get you to strive for your goals and to not limit yourself and to dream big, and I love all those things. It really targets women, and I especially love that because I think a lot of times there is a huge amount of self-doubt that comes into being a female because of sexism in society, and I love that books like this are just no, you can do it. However, there are some very problematic parts to this book, especially relating to shaming people based on their weight, and parts that just didn't come across right to me. Ultimately, that really took away from all the great things that I really liked about this book. Next up is Beneath the Scarlet Sky by Mark Sullivan. This is a Italian World War II historical fiction that I was craving with every ounce of my soul. I really want a good Italian World War II historical fiction because my family lived through that. And this just really did not live up to the hype. And when I say hype, like, this book is really highly rated on Goodreads. The dialogue in here was just so cheesy and so ridiculous. It was like so showing, not telling a situation. Like there was this one scene where they were in the countryside and like the father was playing a violin and it was a super sad moment. And then it just blatantly ruins the scene by saying, and this was a sad moment. Like, don't say what we should be getting from the description. It just felt very forced. Part of it is like the language was a bit more concrete in this book than some other World War II historical fictions that I've read. But there are books like The Nightingale, which I felt like the language was kind of descriptive, but pretty concrete and not as flowery as some other books that I've read. But still, it felt more of like an emotional, nuanced journey rather than like, here is what you need to be feeling right now. And I don't know, it didn't connect with me. I know that there was a lot of anticipation coming into this, so that might have been part of it, but it just felt very forced. Next up is The Kingdom of Back by Marie Lu. This is one of our monthly book club picks, and it was really fun to chat with the girls about this book, but ultimately the reason why this is on this list is that it was just super forgettable for me. I cannot remember really anything about it other than it being a kind of fantastical reimagining of Mozart's life. And I also felt like this book was trying to be a fantasy and trying to be a historical fiction and trying to be like a coming of age story. And it ended up just falling flat for all of those aspects. I really actually was not super invested in the fantasy because I felt like the world building was a little lacking. So I would have preferred if this was more of a historical fiction about Mozart's life, but then at that point, like, it's a different book. So this just didn't come together for me. I think it had potential and I think it was a really interesting concept. I will link the live show if you guys are interested in checking out our full chat, because we explained it probably a lot better than I just did in that chat. And the other girls kind of had similar feelings to me. I can't remember. I know one of the things that we really liked about the book was how it described music and kind of that magical feeling when you listen to music, when you play music. We all really loved that. But yeah, we all thought that there were some aspects of it that fell a little bit short. Next up is Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. I'm not going to talk about this so much because I've talked about this a lot. This is a book that I was really anticipating. It was a book that I really thought I was going to enjoy. It is like a historical romance where a World War II nurse time travels back to, I can't remember, like the Scottish Highlands, and is like an Outlander. And you know, there's like so much about this. You probably know a lot of the plot points before even reading this book. But ultimately, one, I thought this book was too long, and two, there were so many, like, I get that this is a historical romance, and maybe historical romance isn't my genre, but there were so many moments in this that were just like not okay, and I just like felt upset reading them. And I know that like in the time period they were things that happened, but it was just kind of difficult for me to wrap my head around it. And you know, it's hard for an author to be like, oh yeah, by the way, this is wrong, and we know it's wrong in the middle of a scene like that. But I also wanted a little bit more acknowledgement of that. I will list a full list of the trigger warnings for this book because there are many in the description down below if you are interested in picking it up. But on top of that, was just not engaging for the full story. All right, next up is Witches of Ash and Ruin. This was another Tea Leaves book club pick, and this was either October or November, I can't remember, but this was kind of a witchy book that we were all craving in the spooky season, but it ended up just not working for us. And honestly, like, I can't remember all the reasons why I didn't like this. I listened to it on audiobook and I just remember feeling like very unengaged towards the end of it, and I just didn't really feel very invested in it. I will link our live show if you are interested in more of our nuanced thoughts, because clearly I've forgotten why I didn't like it, but I just remember not liking it. And last but not least, which is probably no surprise to many of you, my least favorite book of this year was Weather by Jenny Offill. I will say that I really liked what I thought this book was going to be, which is a kind of climate fiction, slice of life, interesting dichotomy between living our mundane, like, everyday life with the knowledge that there's this existential, like, disaster looming because we are unable to acknowledge the environment in a way that we should. And I think that that setup could have been a really good setup for a funny, witty, interesting book with some like interesting character conflicts. But this book ended up just being really disjointed for me. I could not remember any of the characters, and I know that this wasn't supposed to be like a character-driven book. It was supposed to be more of a commentary, but ultimately, like, I have to be able to cling on to something. If it's not the plot, it has to be the characters. If it's not the characters, it has to be, you know, the writing or something. And ultimately, like, all of this just didn't really work for me. I didn't get it. I know there are people that really enjoyed this and got a lot out of it and loved it, but I just really did not enjoy reading it. And I didn't really get what I thought this book was trying to do. It was not my favorite. It was my first 1 star that I've ever given a book, just because I was so bored of a book that was just over 100 pages. Clearly, I mean, many people liked it. It was a short list for the Women's Prize. There are many people who've talked about this book being one of their favorites of the year. So again, different books for different readers. Clearly this was not my book. Alright guys, that is it for my most disappointing books of 2020. I would love to know what your most disappointing book of 2020 was down below, and why specifically did it disappoint you? Was it the hype, or was it just a book that you picked up on a whim that really did not impress you? And with that, I'm going to leave this video here. I will see you guys all again very soon with another video. Bye.